At my father's funeral, my aunt laughed. Poor Olivia, still trying to act like she matters. My uncle said, her father died a crook with nothing. My cousins whispered about my pitiful family, mocking my shoes and tears. Even my mother stayed quiet. Then 3 black SUVs pulled up. Men in suits stepped out, bowed and said, Miss Olivia, the dawn is waiting. Did you see her shoes? Goodwill special. My cousin Madison's stage whisper cut through the October wind while my father's casket sat beside the grave. She wanted me to hear. She always wanted me to hear. And she's crying like her father was someone important, Madison continued, instead of the neighborhood embarrassment he actually was. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here to witness Olivia's journey. If you believe families should protect each other, not tear each other down, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share more stories like this. Now let's see what happens next. Brett snorted his agreement. Aunt Rebecca smiled. Uncle Dennis nodded like Madison had said something profound instead of something cruel. I kept my eyes on Dad's casket. The modest one Mom and I had scraped together money to afford. The one Uncle Dennis had already called pathetic loud enough for the whole cemetery to hear. Mom stood beside me in silence. Not defending Dad. Not defending me. Just standing there like she'd stood at every family gathering for 23 years while her family tore us apart. Her father died a crook with nothing to his name, Uncle Dennis announced to anyone still listening. Criminal families breed criminal children. That's when I heard the engines. 3 black SUVs rolled through the cemetery gates with synchronized precision. 6 men in expensive suits emerged. The lead man, silver-haired, dangerous, unmistakably powerful, walked directly to me. He took my hand gently and bowed like I was royalty. Miss Olivia. The dawn has been waiting to meet you. Your father spoke of you every day. Vincent Moretti. Everyone in our city knows that name. My aunt made a choking sound. My uncle's face went gray. They'd just spent my father's funeral calling him a nobody. Mocking my tears. Laughing at my shoes. They had no idea who they'd actually been dealing with. The cemetery had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. The priest who'd been edging toward his car stopped mid-step. The handful of mourners who'd been drifting away froze in place. Vincent Moretti still held my hand, his grip gentle but somehow commanding. Up close, I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the small scar on his left cheekbone that suggested a history of violence survived rather than avoided. Behind him, the 5 other men stood in formation. Not threatening exactly, but radiating the kind of controlled power that made it clear they could become threatening in an instant if the situation required it. One of them held an enormous floral arrangement. White roses and lilies assembled into something that belonged at a state funeral, not in this modest cemetery beside the simple bouquets Mom and I had chosen. I apologize for the interruption, Vincent said, turning slightly to address the gathered mourners. His voice was pleasant, almost warm, but something underneath made my survival instincts whisper warnings. But Miss Olivia has matters to attend to. Her father's true family would like to pay their respects. The emphasis on true family wasn't subtle. Neither was the way his gaze swept across Aunt Rebecca, Uncle Dennis, and my cousins before dismissing them as irrelevant. The man holding the massive floral arrangement stepped forward and placed it carefully beside Dad's grave. It dwarfed everything else there, a statement written in flowers that said, "This man mattered. This man was loved. This man was powerful enough that his death brings men like us to pay respects." Miss Olivia, Vincent said, his attention returning to me. When you're ready, the dawn is waiting to meet you. He would have come himself, but... He paused delicately. There are reasons your father kept certain aspects of his life separate from you. The dawn respected those boundaries. But now that Antonio has passed, there are things you need to understand about your heritage. My heritage. The word hung in the air like a question I didn't know how to ask. I looked at my mother one last time. She was staring at Vincent with an expression I'd never seen before. Terror and recognition mixed together in equal parts. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Mom. My voice came out steadier than I expected, considering my entire world had just tilted sideways. She met my eyes briefly, then looked away. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the silent cemetery. Go with them, Olivia. Your father. He would have wanted this. The words confirmed something I'd been suspecting since the SUVs arrived. Mom had known something all along. Maybe not everything, but enough to recognize that men in expensive suits bowing to her daughter at a funeral weren't here by accident. She'd known Dad had secrets, connections, a life beyond the modest insurance salesman routine he'd maintained for 23 years. And she'd still stood silent while her family spent his funeral calling him a crook with nothing. Still said nothing while they mocked my tears and my shoes. Still chose their approval over our dignity, even knowing there was more to the story than they understood. The betrayal of that silence hurt worse than anything Rebecca or Dennis had said. I turned back to Vincent. I'll come with you. His expression warmed slightly, approval maybe or respect. He extended his arm toward the lead SUV, a gesture that was somehow both courtly and commanding. As I took his arm, Aunt Rebecca's voice rose behind us, shrill with panic. Caroline, what is happening? Who are these people? What was Antonio actually involved in? I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. If I looked at Mom's face right now, I might say something I couldn't take back. Or worse, I might cry, and I refused to give my mother's family the satisfaction of seeing me break. Vincent guided me toward the SUV with careful courtesy, like I was something precious that needed protecting. One of his men opened the back door. The interior was more luxurious than any vehicle I'd ever been inside. Leather seats that probably cost more than my college tuition, polished wood trim, an atmosphere of controlled power that made the space feel simultaneously safe and dangerous. Vincent settled into the seat across from me. The door closed with the solid sound of German engineering, sealing us into silence while outside my mother's family descended into chaos. Through the tinted window, I could see Aunt Rebecca grabbing Mom's arm, her mouth moving frantically. Uncle Dennis was staring at the SUVs like he'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Madison and Brett stood frozen, their earlier mockery replaced by something that looked like fear. The SUV began moving, smooth and quiet. The cemetery fell away behind us. I know you have questions, Vincent said gently. His voice had softened now that we were away from the cemetery, away from the performance he'd been giving for my mother's family. And you deserve answers. But first, I need you to understand something important about your father. I waited, my hands clenched in my lap, still wearing the discount store shoes Madison had mocked. Antonio Castellano was Don Salvatore's nephew, Vincent said carefully, watching my reaction. His mother, your grandmother, was the Don's younger sister. Your father wasn't just connected to the Castellano family. He was family. Blood family. And in our world, blood is everything. The words didn't process immediately. Don Salvatore Castellano. The name was legendary in our city. A figure who operated in shadows but whose influence shaped everything from real estate development to union negotiations to which politicians won elections. Every newspaper article about alleged organized crime mentioned that name. Every politician swore they had no connection to him. Every businessperson in certain industries knew that major decisions required his approval. My father. I started, then stopped, not even sure what question to ask first. Your father was the Don's most trusted advisor for 25 years, Vincent continued. He managed the family's legitimate business holdings, restaurants, properties, investments, and served as the bridge between our world and the world you grew up in. The insurance job was real, but it was also cover. A way to explain his comfortable lifestyle without drawing attention to where the money actually came from. The SUV wound through streets I'd known my whole life, but everything looked different now. That restaurant on the corner where Dad used to take me for birthday dinners. Did my family own it? The construction site downtown where new condos were going up. Was that Castellano money reshaping the neighborhood? He kept you separate from all of this, Vincent said, his voice gentle but firm. Not because he was ashamed of you or ashamed of the family. Because he loved you. He wanted you to have choices he never had. A normal life. A future without the weight of family obligations unless you chose to accept them. I thought about Dad's late-night phone calls. The meetings in our home that stopped the moment I entered the room. The way certain people treated him with respect that bordered on fear when we were out in public. The comfortable life we'd lived despite his supposedly modest income. All the pieces I'd never quite understood suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. Your father left specific instructions, Vincent continued. About your education. Your inheritance. Your introduction to the family. Nothing happens without your consent. Nothing is forced on you. But the Don wanted to meet you. To explain things properly. To make sure you understand who your father really was and what he built for you. My father. Antonio Castellano. Not the crook with nothing that Uncle Dennis had described. Not the neighborhood embarrassment Madison had mocked. Someone significant enough that Vincent Moretti himself showed up at the funeral. Someone connected to the most powerful family in the city. Someone who'd spent 23 years protecting me from this truth while my mother's family treated us like garbage. Where are we going? I asked. To meet the Don, Vincent replied. Your great-uncle. He's been waiting to meet you properly since your father passed. He would have come to the funeral himself, but... Vincent paused delicately. Your father wanted your introduction to the family to happen privately. With dignity. Not as a spectacle at a cemetery. The SUV turned into a neighborhood I recognized, historic district, old money, the kind of homes that had belonged to the same families for generations. We pulled up to massive iron gates that opened automatically, revealing an estate that looked like something from a movie about East Coast dynasties. Vincent's expression had shifted again, no longer the dangerous enforcer from the cemetery, but something closer to a patient teacher preparing a student for an important lesson. Before we go inside, he said, his hand resting lightly on my arm, I need you to understand one thing. What happens next is your choice. The Don will explain your inheritance, your options, your father's legacy. But nothing is required of you. You can walk away from all of this with your father's legitimate holdings and live whatever life you choose. Or you can learn. You can understand. You can take your place in the family your father came from. The gates closed behind us with a solid click. Through the windshield I could see the main house. Enormous, elegant, radiating the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. My father had come from this. Had been connected to this. Had chosen to raise me away from all of it because he loved me enough to want me to have choices. And my mother's family had spent 23 years treating him like a failure. The rage that had been building since Madison mocked my shoes at the cemetery crystallized into something cold and focused. Not hot anger that would make me reckless. Cold calculation that Dad had taught me through years of watching him maintain quiet dignity in the face of their insults. They'd called him a crook with nothing. Mocked my tears. Laughed at my discount store shoes. They had no idea who they'd actually been dealing with. But they were about to learn. And I was going to make sure the lesson stuck. The SUV stopped in front of the main house, and Vincent opened my door with the same careful courtesy he'd shown at the cemetery. The October air felt different here. Quieter, heavier, like even the wind knew to be respectful on this property. A man in his 70s stood waiting on the stone steps. White hair, impeccably tailored suit, dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me in a single glance. He didn't move like someone his age should move. There was strength in his posture, authority in the way he held himself. Olivia, he said, and his voice carried traces of Brooklyn mixed with something older. Something that spoke of Sicily and generations of family history. Come inside, please. Vincent gestured for me to go ahead, falling back slightly in a show of deference that told me exactly who was in charge here. I climbed the steps on shaking legs, still wearing the discount store shoes Madison had mocked, still trying to process that the last hour of my life had actually happened. The man extended his hand as I reached the top step. I am Salvatore Castellano. Your great-uncle. Though we've never had the pleasure of meeting properly. His grip was firm but gentle. I'm sorry it took your father's death to bring you home. Home. The word felt strange applied to a place I'd never been, to people I'd never met. He led me through an entrance hall that belonged in a museum. Marble floors, paintings that looked original and expensive, furniture that had probably been in the family for generations. We passed through corridors where other men in suits nodded respectfully as we went by, their expressions carefully neutral. Don Salvatore's study smelled of leather and old books and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe cigars or the particular scent that comes from rooms where important decisions get made. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls. A massive desk dominated the space. Leather chairs that looked like they'd been broken in over decades sat arranged near a fireplace. He gestured to one of those chairs. Please. Sit. I sank into leather that was somehow both firm and comfortable, my hands gripping the armrest to keep them from shaking. Vincent had taken a position near the door, present but not intrusive, like a guard who'd been dismissed but refused to leave completely. Don Salvatore studied my face for a long moment before speaking. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said quietly. Maria. My younger sister. She passed when you were just a baby, but she would have loved knowing you. Antonio spoke of you constantly, your intelligence, your strength, your kindness. He was so proud of the woman you became. Something in my chest cracked at those words. This stranger, this man I'd never met, was acknowledging my grief as real and important. Not embarrassing. Not pathetic. Losing your father. The Don's voice caught slightly, showing vulnerability I suspected few people ever witnessed. It was like losing a son. Antonio was family in every sense that matters. His death diminishes us all. He moved to his desk and returned with a folder thick enough to contain a novel. When he placed it on the small table between us, I could see my name written on the tab in careful handwriting. Your father was a meticulous man, Don Salvatore said, settling into the chair across from me. He prepared for every possibility, including his death. These documents represent your inheritance. My hands shook as I opened the folder. The first page was a property deed. Marina Bay Restaurant Group, a name I vaguely recognized from signs around the city. 12 locations listed with addresses I knew. Underneath, financial statements showing revenue in the millions. I flipped to the next document. Castellano Properties. 37 residential and commercial buildings throughout the metro area, each one listed with current market valuations that made my eyes blur. Stock certificates. Investment portfolios. Bank statements with balances that had so many zeros I had to count them twice to believe what I was seeing. Your father, Don Salvatore said quietly, was worth approximately $42 million when he passed. Every legitimate penny of it now belongs to you. The room performed a slow rotation. I gripped the chair arms harder, trying to anchor myself to something solid while my entire understanding of reality restructured itself. $42 million. While Uncle Dennis called him a crook with nothing. While Aunt Rebecca mocked our modest lifestyle. While Madison laughed at my discount store shoes. While my mother's family spent 23 years treating us like charity cases who didn't understand our place. My father had been worth $42 million. How? The word came out barely a whisper. Your father was brilliant with money, the Don explained. He started with the restaurant business. One location that did well, then another, then another. Each success funded the next venture. He bought properties when the market was down, held them, sold when values increased. He invested wisely. And he did it all legally with proper documentation, clean books, legitimate business practices. Vincent spoke from his position near the door. But there's more than just the money, Miss Olivia. Don Salvatore nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. He reached for another folder, thinner than the first but somehow heavier. Your father also held certain responsibilities within our family organization, the Don said carefully. He mediated disputes between businesspeople who couldn't use traditional courts. He provided protection services for legitimate businesses facing illegal threats. He ensured that certain operations, some legal, some less so, ran efficiently without unnecessary violence. He opened the second folder, revealing what looked like case files. Names, dates, situations, resolutions. I saw mentions of restaurant owners being extorted, construction companies facing sabotage, shop owners being threatened by gangs. Antonio solved problems, Vincent added. The kind of problems police can't or won't handle. The kind that require understanding both legitimate business and the less legitimate world that operates alongside it. These responsibilities don't automatically transfer to you, Don Salvatore said firmly. You inherit the money regardless. You can walk away from all of this right now, live whatever life you choose, and the family will respect that decision completely. Your father made absolutely certain you'd have that choice. I stared at the folders on the table, one representing legitimate wealth beyond anything I'd imagined, the other representing a world I'd only heard about in news reports and movies. But if you want to understand, the Don continued, if you want to learn what your father built and how he built it, that education is available to you. Everything Antonio created can continue through you if that's what you choose. He stood slowly and moved to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound photo album I hadn't noticed. When he opened it, I saw pictures from decades ago. Family gatherings, celebrations, moments from a life Dad had kept completely hidden from me. There was Dad younger laughing at some joke I'd never hear. Dad standing beside a woman who must have been my grandmother, the resemblance unmistakable. Dad at weddings, baptisms, funerals, all the family events that had happened in a world I never knew existed. Your grandmother Maria was my baby sister, Don Salvatore said, his finger tracing her face in one of the photos. When she married your grandfather, may he rest in peace, our father was furious. Your grandfather wasn't Italian, wasn't from our world, wasn't what our father wanted for his daughter. He turned to another page showing my grandmother holding a baby that must have been my father. But Maria loved him and eventually our father accepted it. Antonio grew up understanding both worlds, the legitimate one his father came from, and the family business his mother's side represented. He became the bridge between them, the one who could move in both spaces without drawing attention. I studied the photos, seeing my father's face in contexts I'd never witnessed. He looked confident here, powerful, like someone who commanded respect naturally. He kept you separated not out of shame, the Don said gently, but out of love. He wanted you to have the choices he never had. A normal childhood. A future without the weight of family obligations unless you chose to accept them. He closed the album carefully and returned to his chair, his dark eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. So I'm asking you now, Olivia. What do you want? You can take the money and walk away. No one will judge you. No one will think less of you. Or you can stay. You can learn. You can understand the world your father came from and the legacy he built for you. I thought about my mother standing silent at the funeral. About Aunt Rebecca's cruelty. About Uncle Dennis calling Dad a crook. About Madison mocking my tears and my shoes while Dad's body waited to be buried. 23 years of being treated like garbage by people who had no idea who we really were. I want to learn, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I want to understand what my father built. The Don's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Approval, maybe, or satisfaction. And I want certain people to understand exactly who they've been disrespecting, I added quietly. Don Salvatore and Vincent exchanged a look that said this was exactly the answer they'd hoped for. Then your education begins tomorrow, the Don said. Vincent will be your guide, your teacher, your protection as you learn to navigate your inheritance. But tonight you rest. Process what you've learned. Say goodbye to the girl you were and prepare for the woman you're becoming. Vincent stepped forward. I'll take you home, Miss Olivia. Unless you'd prefer to stay here tonight. I shook my head. I needed to be in my own space, in the home I'd shared with Dad, to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. Don Salvatore stood and embraced me, not the formal hug of a business associate, but the genuine affection of family. Your father loved you more than anything in this world, he said quietly. Everything he did, every choice he made was to protect you and give you the future you deserved. Never doubt that. As Vincent drove me back through the city, I watched buildings and businesses pass by with new understanding. That restaurant where Dad used to take me for birthday dinners. Was it one of the 12 Marina Bay locations? Those apartments under renovation downtown, were they Castellano properties? My entire life had been surrounded by my father's empire, and I'd never known it existed. The discount store shoes that Madison mocked suddenly felt different on my feet. Not shameful. Not embarrassing. Just shoes. Meaningless details that people without real power focused on because they had nothing else to judge. I was the daughter of Antonio Castellano, the heir to a $42 million empire. The great niece of Don Salvatore Castellano. And my mother's family had no idea what their cruelty at the funeral had just cost them. Vincent arrived at my door the next morning at 7 sharp, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a leather portfolio that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent used to be. Past tense. Because apparently I owned properties now, investments, businesses that generated millions. The surrealism of it hadn't worn off overnight. Ready for your first day of school? He asked with a slight smile, handing me one of the coffees. It was exactly how I liked it. Cream, no sugar. Which meant either he'd asked someone or he was the kind of person who paid attention to details most people missed. I suspected the latter. We started at Marina Bay Restaurant Group headquarters, a modest office building in a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying over the past decade. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed organized crime or illegal enterprise. Just a professional office with the company name on a tasteful bronze plaque beside the entrance. The woman who met us in the lobby was in her 40s. dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a business suit that was professional without being ostentatious. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Miss Castellano," she said, and hearing my last name spoken with respect instead of contempt felt strange. "I'm Isabella Romano. I've been managing operations for your father for 12 years. She led us to a conference room where financial reports were already laid out, organized by location and quarter. As she walked me through the numbers, I realized these weren't just restaurants. They were carefully orchestrated operations that provided jobs and stability to hundreds of families. Your father visited every location monthly," Isabella explained, pulling up employee rosters on her laptop. "He knew every manager's name, most of the servers, even the kitchen staff. People didn't work for your father because they were afraid of him. They worked for him because he treated them fairly and paid them well." She showed me profit and loss statements, payroll records, supplier contracts. Everything was meticulously documented, professionally managed, completely legitimate. The pride in her voice when she talked about Dad was unmistakable. This wasn't fear or obligation. This was genuine respect for a man who'd built something valuable. "He never missed a payroll," she said quietly. "Even during the recession when half the restaurants in this city were closing, your father made sure every single employee got paid on time. He took losses himself rather than lay people off." I thought about Uncle Dennis calling him a crook. About Aunt Rebecca implying his money came from dirty deals and illegal activities. These restaurants were feeding families, providing healthcare benefits, creating opportunities. There was nothing dirty about that. After Marina Bay, Vincent took me to Castellano Properties where I met Daniel Foster. A man in his 50s with graying temples and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades managing buildings and dealing with tenant issues. "Your father had a philosophy about real estate," Daniel explained as we drove past several of the properties in his portfolio. "He bought buildings in neighborhoods that needed investment, renovated them properly and charged fair rents. Not rock bottom, he wasn't running a charity, but fair. Enough that working families could afford them, but enough to maintain the properties correctly and turn a reasonable profit." We stopped at a 3-story apartment building that had clearly been renovated recently. Fresh paint, new windows, a small courtyard that looked well maintained. "This building was condemned when your father bought it 15 years ago," Daniel said. "Drug dealers operating out of half the units. Landlord had abandoned it, city was planning to demolish. Your father bought it, cleaned it out, renovated every unit and turned it into affordable housing. The families living here now? Most of them have been here over a decade. That's stability. That's community." He showed me photos on his phone, before and after shots that told a story of transformation and investment. Dad hadn't been a slumlord extracting maximum profit. He'd been building something that lasted, something that improved neighborhoods instead of exploiting them. "Antonio was tough but fair," Daniel continued as we walked the property. "Tenants who paid rent on time and followed basic rules? He'd work with them if they hit hard times, give them payment plans, help them out. Tenants who destroyed property or caused problems for neighbors. He didn't tolerate that. But he always gave people chances to do the right thing before consequences happened. Every person I met that first week treated Dad's memory with genuine affection. Not the fake sympathy people offer at funerals. Real respect born from years of working with someone who valued competence and treated people with dignity. The contrast to my mother's family couldn't have been sharper." On the 4th day, Vincent took me to meet Elena Ricci in a small office above one of the Marina Bay restaurants. She was sharp-eyed and direct, with the kind of presence that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Your father handled what we call community relations," she explained, gesturing to file cabinets that lined one wall of her office. "Problems that traditional channels can't or won't solve. Disputes that need mediation. Situations that require creative solutions." She pulled out a file at random and opened it on the desk between us. Inside were detailed notes about a restaurant owner being extorted by gang members who'd decided his business should pay protection money. "Police couldn't help," Elena said. "Victim was too scared to testify. Gang had political connections that made official intervention complicated. Your father stepped in, had conversations with the gang's leadership, explained that this particular business was under Castellano protection, and suggested they focus their activities elsewhere. Problems solved without violence." She showed me case after case. A construction company facing sabotage from competitors who didn't like honest bidding. A shop owner being pressured by loan sharks charging illegal interest. A family business being targeted by developers who wanted the property and didn't care about legal methods of acquisition. In each case, Dad had intervened. Sometimes with negotiations. Sometimes with pressure applied to the right people. Sometimes with solutions that existed in gray areas between legal and illegal. Your father prevented violence, Elena said firmly. The neighborhood mourned him because he kept people safe in ways the system couldn't or wouldn't. He wasn't a saint. This work requires getting your hands dirty sometimes. But he had principles. Protect the innocent. Stop the bullies. Make sure ordinary people could live and work without being victimized. It was a far cry from the criminal empire Aunt Rebecca always implied. Yes, Dad operated outside normal channels. Yes, some of his methods weren't strictly legal. But he was protecting people who had nowhere else to turn. On the 6th day, Vincent brought me to Bennett Auto Repair in a neighborhood I recognized from childhood. The shop was small but clean, with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot that should have been full of customers but held only 3 cars. Marcus Bennett came out wiping his hands on a rag, his face showing exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. He was maybe 55, with the build of someone who'd done manual labor his whole life and the defeated posture of someone watching his dreams collapse. "Miss Castellano," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his obvious stress. "I appreciate you taking the time. Your father helped me once before, about 10 years back when I was just starting out. I was hoping you might have inherited his sense of fairness." We sat in his small office while he explained the situation. A larger auto chain had moved into the area and decided Marcus's independent shop was competition they didn't need. They'd started with predatory pricing, undercutting him until they bled money themselves, then moved to intimidation, vandalism, threatening his employees, anonymous complaints to city inspectors about violations that didn't exist. "I've lost half my customers in 3 months, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've got 5 employees who depend on me, families who need their paychecks. If this continues another month, I'll have to close. 20 years of building this business gone." Vincent watched me carefully as Marcus talked. This was a test, I realized. My first real decision. My first chance to use the power I'd inherited. I asked questions. Who owned the competing chain? What specific tactics were they using? Had Marcus tried legal channels? The answers painted a clear picture of systematic intimidation designed to destroy competition. The hot rage I'd felt at Dad's funeral had cooled into something more focused, more strategic. This was exactly the kind of situation Dad had handled. Honest businessman being destroyed by bullies who had more resources and no ethics. "Give me 3 days, I told Marcus. "Don't make any decisions about closing. Just give me 3 days." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you. I don't know what you can do, but thank you for trying." As we left, Vincent's expression showed something close to approval. "Your father would handle it exactly that way," he said. "Listen, sis. Promise nothing specific but give hope. Then deliver results." "How would he have handled it?" I asked. "By finding pressure points," Vincent replied. "Everyone has vulnerabilities. The trick is finding them and applying pressure precisely where it matters most. Not displays. Not threats. Just quiet, effective action that makes people realize continuing their current behavior will cost them more than they're willing to pay." I was beginning to understand what Dad had really done. Not violence. Not crude intimidation. Strategic application of pressure backed by information and resources most people didn't possess. Power used with precision instead of brutality. That evening I drove to the small house Mom and I had shared with Dad. She was in the living room surrounded by boxes she'd been packing, his things scattered everywhere like artifacts of a life she was finally admitting she didn't understand. She looked up when I entered, her face showing guilt and something else. Fear maybe, or uncertainty about where we stood now. "Olivia," she said, standing awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." I sat in Dad's chair, the worn recliner where he'd read newspapers and watched games and pretended his life was as simple as his insurance job suggested. "What did you know, Mom?" I asked directly. About Dad's real life. His family. His business. She sat back down heavily, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before she finally spoke. I knew he came from money, she admitted quietly. I knew he had connections. Important connections. But Antonio kept details vague and I learned not to ask questions. Why? Because asking questions meant acknowledging things I didn't want to acknowledge, she said, her voice breaking. Your father told me once early in our marriage that his family's business involved activities that existed in gray areas. He said the less I knew the safer I'd be. And I chose not to know. Even when your family treated him like garbage for 23 years? She flinched. I thought defending him would make things worse. That if I pushed back my family would cut us off completely and then where would we be? Where would you be, you mean? I corrected. You were worried about losing their approval. Not about Dad's dignity. Not about protecting me from their cruelty. I was scared, she whispered. Of being alone. Of losing the only family I had left besides you and Antonio. So you sacrificed us instead. She started crying, quiet, defeated tears that should have moved me but mostly just made me tired. The men in the SUVs, she said after a moment. At the funeral. That was his family. Yes. And they came for you? They came to tell me who I really am, I said. Who Dad really was. What he built. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Terror maybe, mixed with dawning realization that the modest life we'd lived had been an elaborate fiction Dad maintained to protect us. What are you going to do? She asked. Learn, I said simply. Understand what Dad created. Take my place in the family he came from. Olivia, that world is my birthright, I interrupted. Whether you like it or not. The gulf between us had never felt wider. She'd made her choices, silence, weakness, choosing comfort over courage. I was making mine. I left without promising to visit again soon. She didn't ask me to. 3 months passed while I learned to navigate my inheritance. 3 months of morning meetings with Vincent, afternoons studying business operations, evenings reviewing case files about Dad's community work. 3 months of transformation from the girl who'd stood at her father's grave in discount store shoes to someone who understood what real power looked like. Then Madison called. My phone rang on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing property portfolios in the study of the townhouse I'd purchased. Modest by Castellano standards, but light years beyond the small house I'd shared with Mom and Dad. The number that appeared made me pause. I hadn't heard from any of Mom's family since the funeral. Olivia. Madison's voice had artificial sweetness that immediately raised every guard I'd learned to build over 3 months of education. I've been thinking about you so much. How are you doing? I let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. I'm well, Madison. What can I do for you? Well, I know things were tense at Uncle Antonio's funeral. The way she said tense, like we'd had a minor disagreement rather than her mocking my tears while my father's body waited to be buried. But we're family, right? And I thought maybe we could reconnect. Maybe have lunch sometime. Lunch, I repeated neutrally, waiting for the real reason she'd called. Actually, her false sweetness cracked slightly. I heard you inherited some money from Uncle Antonio. And Brett and I were starting this boutique marketing agency. Really exciting opportunity. But we could use an investor who believes in family supporting family. I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. The same cousin who'd called us the pitiful family now wanted money from the inheritance she'd assumed didn't exist. How much are you looking for? I asked, keeping my voice calm and curious. Well, to really launch properly we'd need about 60,000. But even 30 or 40 would help us get started. And obviously you'd see returns once we're profitable. This is a real investment opportunity, not just a handout. $60,000. To Madison that probably seemed like an enormous sum. She had no idea I could write that check without even checking my account balance. That's interesting, I said. Tell me about your business plan. She launched into a rambling pitch about social media marketing and brand development and leveraging synergies. All the buzzwords people use when they don't actually understand business. I let her talk, asking occasional questions that made her think I was seriously considering the investment. You know what? I said when she finally ran out of rehearsed pitch. This sounds like something we should discuss properly. Why don't we talk about it at Christmas dinner? I'm hosting this year. The pause on the line was pregnant with calculation. Christmas dinner? At your place. I have more space now, I said simply. And I think it's time for some new family traditions. I'll send invitations to everyone. You, Brett, your parents, my mother. I have some announcements to make anyway. We can discuss your business proposal then. Madison was clearly weighing whether to push for faster access to money or accept the invitation that would put her in my space on my terms. That's really generous of you, Olivia, she said finally. Christmas dinner sounds perfect. After hanging up, I immediately called Vincent. My cousin just asked me for $60,000 to start a marketing agency, I told him. I think we're ready to move forward with the Christmas revelation. How do you want to structure it? His voice carried approval even through the phone. I want them all there. All the people who mocked Dad at his funeral. And I want documentation they can't dispute. Bank statements, property deeds, business licenses. Everything that proves exactly who Dad was and what he built. Consider it done. I'll have complete dossiers ready by next week. The dossiers arrived in leather portfolios 5 days later. Vincent spread them across the dining table in my townhouse, and we reviewed each one systematically. Uncle Dennis first. His import business was hemorrhaging money. Poor inventory decisions, terrible vendor relationships, customers abandoning him for more reliable competitors. He was maybe 3 months from bankruptcy, but hiding it from everyone by taking cash advances on credit cards to cover basic expenses. He's been telling people business is great, Vincent said, tapping financial statements that told a very different story. But the numbers don't lie. He's drowning. Aunt Rebecca's folder was even more revealing. Credit card debt approaching 6 figures. Designer clothes purchased to maintain appearances while minimum payments got missed. Her credit score had dropped over 100 points in the past year alone. She buys things to prove she's successful, I observed, studying purchase histories. Handbags, jewelry, restaurant meals she can't afford. All performance. Madison and Brett's files showed similar desperation masked as ambition. Both had lost jobs in the past year. Madison from a marketing firm after missing deadlines repeatedly, Brett from a sales position after performance warnings he'd ignored. They were living off their parents while pretending to friends that they'd decided to pursue entrepreneurship. The marketing agency Madison had pitched was desperation in a business plan. No actual clients. No concrete strategy. Just hope that calling themselves business owners would somehow generate income. They've spent 23 years looking down on your family, Vincent said quietly, while building lives that are one financial crisis away from complete collapse. The irony was almost poetic. They'd mocked Dad as a poor crook while he sat on $42 million in legitimate assets. They'd called us pitiful while drowning in debt they couldn't acknowledge. I want to show them, I said. Not destroy them. Just show them the truth they've been too arrogant to see. Vincent nodded. Your father would approve of that approach. I spent the next week preparing. I purchased an estate in the historic district. Not the largest house available, but impressive enough to make a statement. The kind of place where old money lived quietly but visibly. The address alone would raise questions. The Christmas invitations went out on heavy cardstock with elegant script. Formal but warm. Deliberately vague about what announcements I'd be making, just enough to ensure curiosity and attendance. Vincent connected me with an event coordinator who understood exactly what kind of dinner I wanted. Comfortable but clearly expensive. Catering from Marina Bay's flagship location. The one Isabella told me had hosted 3 governors and countless city officials over the years. Wines from Dad's personal collection that Vincent had transferred to my new home's wine cellar. Table settings that whispered elegance rather than shouting ostentation. The goal, I explained to the coordinator, is to create an atmosphere where they realize something's changed, but they can't quite identify what until we're ready to reveal it. We prepared presentation folders for each family member. Carefully selected documents about Dad's business holdings. Property deeds. Financial statements. Articles about community programs he'd funded. Nothing classified or sensitive, just legitimate proof of who Antonio Castellano had really been. Vincent suggested bringing Don Salvatore to the dinner. His presence would make the power dynamic unmistakable, he argued. I shook my head. This first revelation needs to be about Dad's legacy. About showing them who they disrespected. Not about intimidating them with family connections. That comes later if necessary. Your father would handle it exactly that way, Vincent said approvingly. The night before Christmas dinner, I met with Don Salvatore in his study. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey that probably cost more than my mother's monthly salary used to be. Another detail from my old life that felt increasingly distant. Tomorrow's a big day, he observed, settling into the leather chair across from me. Tell me what you hope to accomplish. I considered the question honestly. Part of me wants to see them suffer the way they made Dad and me suffer for 23 years. He nodded slowly, no judgment in his expression. That's natural. They hurt you. You want them to feel what that hurt was like. But I don't know if that's what Dad would want, I admitted. He spent his whole life being patient with them. Dignified. Taking their insults without striking back. Don Salvatore took a sip of his whiskey, studying me with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Let me tell you a story about revenge, he said finally. When I was young, maybe 25, a man humiliated my father at a public event. Made him look weak in front of people whose respect mattered. I wanted to hurt him. Wanted him to pay in blood for disrespecting my family. He paused, the memory clearly still sharp decades later. My father sat me down and explained something I've never forgotten. He said revenge should never be about destruction. It should be about balance. About teaching lessons that create understanding rather than just causing pain. What did you do? I asked. I showed the man the truth about himself, Don Salvatore replied. Revealed his own weaknesses and failures in ways he couldn't ignore or deny. Made him understand exactly what he'd done and why it was wrong. That lesson lasted far longer than any physical punishment would have. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. You have the power now to destroy your mother's family financially. I could make a few calls and by New Year's their credit would be ruined, Dennis's business would be foreclosed, Rebecca would lose everything. It would be easy. But, I prompted. But is that what your father would have wanted? Don Salvatore asked. Antonio spent 23 years showing them quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. He taught you patience and strategy through his example. Would he want you to use his legacy to become the kind of person who destroys families? I thought about Dad reading the newspaper in his worn recliner. About the way he'd handled Mom's family's insults with calm responses that never stooped to their level. About the businesses he'd built that helped people instead of exploiting them. I want them to understand who they disrespected, I said slowly. To acknowledge their mistakes. To see the truth about themselves and about Dad. But I don't want to become the cruel person they were. Don Salvatore smiled, genuine warmth that transformed his usually stern expression. You're more like your father than you know, he said. Antonio would be very proud of the woman you're becoming. He raised his glass in a small toast. Tomorrow you show them the truth. You give them the chance to recognize their mistakes and choose how to respond. That's justice, Olivia. Real justice. Not revenge disguised as righteousness. I clinked my glass against his, feeling some of the anger that had been building for 3 months shift into something more focused. More controlled. Tomorrow my mother's family would learn exactly who Antonio Castellano had been. They'd see the empire they'd mocked, understand the legacy they'd dismissed, recognize the catastrophic error in judgment they'd made at his funeral. And then I'd give them a choice about what to do with that knowledge. Just like Dad would have done. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and cold air that felt appropriate for what I had planned. I stood at the window of my new estate watching the street, nerves and anticipation mixing in equal parts. This wasn't just dinner. This was the moment everything changed. Uncle Dennis's sedan pulled through the iron gates at exactly 5:45, 15 minutes early. They'd probably spent the drive speculating about where I'd gotten money for a house in this neighborhood, rehearsing questions disguised as concern. I watched them emerge from the car. Aunt Rebecca first, wearing what was probably supposed to be designer but looked like expensive knockoff even from a distance. Her head swiveled taking in the property, expression cycling through confusion and calculation. Uncle Dennis stepped out more slowly, his eyes already assessing, measuring, trying to determine what all of this cost. Madison and Brett emerged from the back seat exchanging looks I recognized. Resentment mixed with greed, the kind of expression people get when they realize someone they look down on might actually have something they want. Mom was last, trailing behind them all, her body language screaming discomfort. She knew things they didn't. She understood that tonight wouldn't be the family reconciliation they were probably expecting. I opened the door myself before they reached it. The event coordinator had suggested having staff answer, but I wanted this moment to feel personal. This wasn't about displaying wealth. This was about showing them truth. Olivia. Aunt Rebecca's voice was overly bright, artificial warmth that didn't reach her eyes. This house is... my goodness. How on earth did you afford this place? The question was accusation disguised as curiosity. She wanted me to admit I'd gotten money from somewhere questionable, something that would confirm their long-held beliefs about Dad's criminal connections. Dad left me well provided for, I said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. The foyer did the talking I didn't need to do. Marble floors, crystal chandelier, furniture that whispered old money rather than shouting new wealth. Uncle Dennis's eyes catalogued everything with barely concealed envy. This is quite the upgrade from that little house you shared with Antonio, he observed, and somehow he made it sound like an insult. Different circumstances, I replied neutrally. Let me take your coats. Madison and Brett hadn't said anything yet, but I could see them reassessing everything they thought they knew about me. The cousin they'd mocked at the funeral was suddenly living in a house that probably cost more than they'd earn in their lifetimes. I led them to the dining room where the table was set with china and crystal from Dad's collection. Pieces Isabella had told me he'd acquired over years, each one chosen carefully. The wine glasses alone probably cost more than Uncle Dennis's car payment. Mom's eyes darted around nervously, like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. She knew enough to be worried even if she didn't know exactly what I had planned. Dinner started with uncomfortable small talk. The catering staff, trained professionals from Marina Bay's flagship location, served appetizers while my mother's family made careful conversation that avoided acknowledging the obvious questions hanging in the air. By the main course, Uncle Dennis's patience had worn thin. So Olivia, he said, setting down his fork with deliberate emphasis. We should probably discuss your situation. The word situation came out like I was a problem that needed managing. My situation? I asked calmly. This house. The sudden wealth. We're family. We should understand what's going on with you. Aunt Rebecca nodded agreement. Especially given your father's complicated business dealings. We just want to make sure you're not getting involved in anything questionable. The irony was almost too perfect. They were sitting in my house, eating my food, drinking wine from my cellar, and still managing to imply I was doing something wrong. Dad left me several things to manage, I said, keeping my voice level. I've spent the past 3 months learning about his business interests. Aunt Rebecca's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. Business interests? Antonio sold insurance, Olivia. He barely scraped by. Whatever money you think you have. Let me show you something, I interrupted, standing and retrieving the presentation folders Vincent and I had prepared. I placed one in front of each person at the table, my mother included. What's this? Uncle Dennis asked suspiciously. Information about Dad that you might not have known, I said, returning to my seat and opening my own folder. I thought it was time you understood who Antonio Castellano actually was. I started with Marina Bay Restaurant Group. Walked them through the business licenses, the property deeds, the financial statements showing 12 locations and annual revenue in the millions. Showed them employee rosters, tax returns, articles about the company's role in neighborhood revitalization. This is fake, Uncle Dennis said, but his voice lacked conviction. Antonio worked in insurance. I slid notarized documents across the table. Business licenses with official seals. Property deeds recorded with the city. Tax returns filed with the federal government. Every piece of paper was legitimate and verifiable. Madison's face had gone pale. Brett's nervous laugh sounded forced. Aunt Rebecca was staring at the documents like they might spontaneously combust if she looked away. I continued methodically through Castellano properties. 37 residential and commercial buildings. Current market valuations. Tenant agreements. Photos of renovated properties that had transformed neighborhoods. Then the investment portfolios. Stock certificates. Bond holdings. Diversified assets managed by registered financial advisors with documentation spanning 2 decades. I don't understand, Mom whispered, and I almost believed she was seeing these numbers for the first time. Almost. Dad built an empire, I said simply. A legitimate business empire that employed hundreds of people and improved thousands of lives. He just chose to live quietly and keep it private. Aunt Rebecca's voice went shrill. Why would he hide all this money if he actually had it? Why live in that tiny house and let Caroline work if he was worth $42 million, I finished for her. That's what Dad was worth when he died. And every legitimate penny of it came to me. The number landed like a physical blow. Madison actually gasped. Brett's fork clattered onto his plate. Uncle Dennis's face went through several colors before settling on a grayish white. Aunt Rebecca's expression cycled through shock, disbelief, rage, and finally something that looked like dawning horror as she processed what this meant. What she'd said at the funeral about a man worth $42 million. That's not possible, Uncle Dennis said weakly. We would have known. Your mother would have told us. Mom knew Dad had money, I said, looking at her directly. She just chose not to share that information with you. Isn't that right, Mom? She stared at her plate, saying nothing. Choosing silence again, just like at the funeral. I own property throughout this city now, I continued, my voice calm and factual. I employ hundreds of people. I manage community programs that have helped thousands of families. Everything you thought you knew about Dad and me was wrong. The silence around the table was deafening. Then Madison desperately tried to salvage her investment pitch. Olivia, I know this is a lot of information, but about the marketing agency Brett and I want to start. Why should I invest $60,000 in a business run by someone who mocked my shoes at my father's funeral? The question hung in the air like smoke. Madison's face flushed deep red. I didn't mean anything by that, she stammered. I was upset. People say things when they're upset. You called us the pitiful family, I said quietly. You and Brett whispered about how Dad died a crook with nothing. You mocked my tears while his body waited to be buried. I pulled out the second folder, the one with Vincent's research. Since we're talking about business investments, let me share some information about your financial situations. Uncle Dennis's business was failing. The import company hemorrhaging money from poor decisions and bad management. 3 months from bankruptcy but hiding it from everyone. Aunt Rebecca's credit card debt approaching 6 figures. Designer purchases she couldn't afford, maintaining appearances while drowning in minimum payments. Madison and Brett both unemployed for nearly a year, living off their parents while pretending to be successful young professionals. The marketing agency was desperation masked as entrepreneurship. I didn't need to be cruel about it. The numbers spoke for themselves. You spent 23 years calling us poor, I said, my voice level. Calling Dad a crook with nothing. Treating us like charity cases who didn't know our place. And the entire time, you were building lives that are one financial crisis away from complete collapse. I let that sink in before continuing. You mocked a man worth $42 million as someone who died with nothing. You insulted his daughter's shoes and tears at his funeral. And now you want that same daughter to solve your financial problems with the inheritance you claimed didn't exist. Aunt Rebecca started crying, not tears of remorse but tears of rage and humiliation. The kind of crying people do when they realize they've made a catastrophic error and have no way to fix it. Where did you get our financial information? Uncle Dennis demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. That's private. You had no right. Successful people have resources, I said simply. Dad taught me that. Among other things. Uncle Dennis pushed back from the table, his face purple with fury. This is outrageous. You invite us here under false pretenses, humiliate us with accusations. I invited you here to share information about Dad's legacy, I corrected. You're the ones who spent dinner implying I was involved in something questionable. You're the ones who called him a crook at his funeral. I'm just showing you the truth you were too arrogant to see. Aunt Rebecca stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. We're leaving. Dennis, get the car. Madison, Brett, we're going. They fled like the house was on fire, their footsteps echoing through the foyer. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the chandelier. Mom sat at the table staring at her untouched dessert, tears sliding silently down her face. You knew, I said quietly. All along you knew. She nodded without looking up. And you let them treat us like garbage anyway. Another nod. Still no words. Still choosing silence over courage. I stood, suddenly exhausted by all of it. The planning, the revelation, the years of accumulated hurt finally acknowledged. You can stay if you want, I told her. Guest room is upstairs, second door on the left. Or you can leave. Your choice. I walked away, leaving her alone in the dining room with the ruins of Christmas dinner and the weight of 23 years of cowardice. I found Mom still sitting at the dining table an hour later, staring at her untouched wine glass like it might contain answers to questions she was afraid to ask. The caterers had cleared the dishes, packed up quietly, and left us alone in the house that suddenly felt too large and too empty. I poured myself wine and sat across from her, waiting. The silence stretched between us like the gulf that had been widening for 3 months. No, for 23 years if I was being honest with myself. I knew, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. About the money. About his family connections. Not everything, but enough. I took a sip of wine and said nothing. She needed to say this without prompting. When Antonio and I got married, he told me his family was complicated. That they had business interests that existed in gray areas. And the less I knew, the safer I'd be. Her hands twisted in her lap. He made me promise never to tell my family because he didn't trust them. He said they'd either try to use the information against us or accidentally expose things that needed to stay private. So you knew he had money, I said quietly. You knew he came from power. And you still let them treat us like charity cases for 23 years. I thought defending him would make things worse, she said, tears starting to flow again. I thought if I pushed back, if I acknowledged what I knew, my family would cut us off completely. And then where would we be? Where would you be, you mean? She flinched but didn't deny it. I was scared of being alone. Of losing the only family I had left besides you and Antonio. I kept telling myself that their opinions didn't matter, that as long as we knew the truth, what they thought was irrelevant. But it did matter, I said. Because their cruelty hurt Dad. It hurt me. And you chose to let that happen rather than risk your relationship with people who didn't even respect you. I know. Her voice cracked. The funeral was the worst. Hearing Dennis call Antonio a crook, hearing Madison mock you, knowing I should say something but being too terrified to speak up. I kept thinking about what would happen if I defended him. Rebecca would ask questions, I'd have to lie or tell truths I'd promised never to tell, and everything would get worse. I studied her face. The woman who'd raised me, who'd read me bedtime stories and helped with homework and taught me to drive. The woman who'd also stood silent while her family destroyed us piece by piece. What happens now? She asked, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Can you forgive me? The question hung between us. I wanted to say yes, to tell her everything would be okay, to bridge the gulf that had opened so wide I couldn't see across it anymore. I don't know, I said honestly. Your silence hurt almost as much as their cruelty. Maybe more because you were supposed to be on our side. You were supposed to protect us. I was trying to protect you, she protested weakly. If they'd known about Antonio's real family, if they'd started asking questions, talking to the wrong people. Dad protected me just fine without your help, I interrupted. He built an empire while keeping me completely safe. You weren't protecting me by staying silent. You were protecting yourself from having to make hard choices. She had no response to that. We sat in silence while the truth of it settled between us. Finally she stood. I should go. I don't think I should stay here tonight. I didn't try to stop her. Just walked her to the door and watched her drive away in the same silence she'd maintained for 23 years. The call from Vincent came the next morning while I was still drinking coffee and processing the emotional wreckage of Christmas dinner. We have a problem, he said without preamble. Your Uncle Dennis has been asking questions. Loud questions. About the Castellano family. I set down my coffee cup carefully. What kind of questions? The kind that get back to people who matter. He's been talking to neighbors, business associates, anyone who'll listen about whether Antonio was connected to organized crime and whether you're now involved with the Castellano organization. My stomach dropped. How bad is it? Bad enough that the Don wants to meet with you this morning. Dennis is making himself a liability, and when people become liabilities, decisions have to be made about how to handle them. The implication in Vincent's voice was clear. I'd wanted to teach my family a lesson. Instead, I might have put Uncle Dennis in actual danger. I'll be there in an hour, I said. Don Salvatore's expression when I entered his study wasn't angry. If anything, he looked almost pleased, like a teacher watching a student encounter a challenging problem. Sit, he said, gesturing to the familiar leather chair. We need to discuss your uncle's sudden interest in family history. Vincent said he's been asking questions. Loudly. Indiscreetly. In places where such questions attract unwanted attention. The Don leaned back in his chair. He's telling anyone who'll listen that his niece is connected to the Castellano organization and he wants to understand what that means. Several people have asked me whether we have a problem that needs handling. The words, needs handling, carried implications that made my mouth go dry. I don't want him hurt, I said quickly. He's ignorant and cruel, but he's still family. That's the right instinct, Don Salvatore said, nodding approval. But let me ask you a different question. What would you do if Dennis's questions put you in danger? Or your mother? What if his indiscretion exposed family business to authorities who'd love an excuse to investigate Castellano operations? I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on showing them the truth about Dad that I hadn't considered the consequences of revealing my own connections to the family. Actions have consequences beyond what we intend, the Don continued, his voice patient but firm. Having power means taking responsibility for what that power sets in motion. You wanted your family to understand who they'd been disrespecting. Now they know. And now they're reacting in ways that create new problems requiring new solutions. He poured 2 small glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. You have 3 options, he said. 1. Vincent visits Dennis with a clear warning that further questions will have serious consequences. This is effective but creates fear and resentment. People who are frightened sometimes do unpredictable things. I nodded, following his reasoning. 2. We provide Dennis with information that satisfies his curiosity but contains nothing actually damaging. Give him enough truth to stop him digging, but carefully controlled truth. This requires trust that he'll accept what we tell him and stop asking questions. And the 3rd option? Give him what he wants, Don Salvatore said simply. His business is failing. He needs money. We provide a loan, substantial enough to solve his immediate problems, with terms generous enough that he feels grateful rather than trapped. In exchange, he stops asking questions about family matters that don't concern him. He studied my reaction carefully. Your father would have chosen option 3. Antonio believed in solving problems by creating obligations and relationships rather than enemies and fear. Turn a potential threat into someone who owes you favors. It's more expensive in the short term but more effective long term. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Unknown number, but something made me answer. Olivia? It's your Aunt Melissa. I hadn't heard that voice in years. Mom's youngest sister had moved to Oregon after marrying young and mostly disconnected from the family drama. We exchanged Christmas cards but rarely spoke. Aunt Melissa? I stepped out of the Don's study into the hallway. Is everything okay? I just got off the phone with Rebecca, she said, her voice tight with anger. She called ranting about Christmas dinner, about how you humiliated them with lies about Antonio's wealth. She wanted me to back her up, to agree that you were being cruel and inappropriate. What did you tell her? I told her she was an idiot who finally got what she deserved. Melissa's laugh was sharp. I wanted to hear your side directly, though. What actually happened? I gave her the condensed version. The funeral, my education into Dad's real life, the Christmas revelation about his wealth and legacy. Good, Melissa said when I finished. Rebecca and Dennis treated Antonio like garbage for years. I always thought it was cruel and unfair. You never said anything. Because saying something would have meant getting dragged into family drama I wanted no part of. She paused. But there's something you should know. Something I never told anyone because Antonio asked me to keep it private. I waited, feeling Don Salvatore's presence in the study behind me, listening. When my husband left me 12 years ago, I was broke and desperate. Had 2 kids, no job, no savings. I called Antonio because I didn't know where else to turn. Her voice softened with memory. He sent me $15,000. Said it was a gift, not a loan. Told me family was supposed to help family without keeping score. That money got me through the worst 6 months of my life. I hadn't known. Dad had never mentioned it. He made me promise not to tell Rebecca or Dennis, Melissa continued. Said they wouldn't understand, that they'd either judge me for needing help or judge him for giving it. So I kept it private. But I never forgot that your father saved me when my own sister wouldn't have lifted a finger to help. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. There's more, Melissa said, her tone shifting. Rebecca is talking about challenging Antonio's will. She's claiming he must have acquired his wealth through illegal means and therefore it should be redistributed to legitimate family members. She's looking for lawyers who'll take the case. My hand tightened on the phone. On what grounds? Greed disguised as moral outrage, Melissa said bluntly. She thinks if she can prove the money came from criminal activity, a court might redistribute the estate. It's nonsense. She has no evidence, no standing, nothing but spite and jealousy. But she's angry enough to try. If it comes to legal challenges, Melissa continued, I want you to know I'll testify about Antonio's character and generosity. I'll tell any court that asks that your father was a good man who helped people without expecting anything in return. Rebecca doesn't get to rewrite history just because she's embarrassed about being wrong. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway processing everything. Uncle Dennis asking dangerous questions. Aunt Rebecca planning legal challenges. Mom's hollow apologies. And Melissa, an unexpected ally who actually understood who Dad had been. I returned to the Don's study. He was waiting patiently, his whiskey untouched. My aunt is planning to challenge Dad's will, I told him. Claims the money must be illegal. It's not, Don Salvatore said calmly. Every penny Antonio left you came through legitimate business operations with documentation that would survive any legal scrutiny. Let her waste money on lawyers. They'll tell her she has no case. And Uncle Dennis? That's still your decision, the Don said. But now you understand the full picture. Your family isn't just asking questions, they're actively trying to undermine what your father built. How you respond will define who you become. I thought about Dad's patience, his strategic thinking, his belief in turning enemies into obligations. Option 3, I said finally. Give Dennis the loan. Create an obligation instead of an enemy. Don Salvatore smiled. Your father would be proud. Vincent arranged the meeting for the following afternoon at Bennett Auto Repair. The location was deliberate, neutral ground that also served as a reminder of exactly what kind of work the Castellano family did and who benefited from it. Marcus called Uncle Dennis personally, saying he'd heard Dennis had questions about Antonio Castellano and the family, and maybe they could talk privately. Dennis, apparently thinking he'd found someone willing to gossip, agreed immediately. I arrived an hour early with Vincent. Marcus greeted us at his shop entrance, looking nervous but determined. Your father helped me when I had nowhere else to turn, he said quietly. If I can return that favor by helping his daughter handle a problem, that's the least I can do. When Dennis's car pulled into the lot, I was sitting in Marcus's small office with Vincent standing near the door. Marcus went out to meet him, all friendly handshakes and small talk, leading him inside before Dennis realized what was happening. He stopped cold when he saw me. What is this? Dennis demanded, his face flushing red. Marcus, you said you wanted to talk. I do want to talk, Marcus interrupted. About why you've been asking questions that are making good people nervous. Dennis's eyes darted between me, Vincent, and Marcus, calculation visible in his expression. I don't know what you're talking about. You were at the diner on 5th Street yesterday, Vincent said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Dennis stiffen. Asking the man at the next table if he knew anything about Antonio Castellano's mob connections. Loud enough that half the restaurant heard you. I have every right to ask questions about my brother-in-law's business dealings, Dennis blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Especially when my niece suddenly appears with unexplained wealth and connections too. You have rights, I interrupted. But rights come with responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is understanding that your loud questions are endangering people. Including your own sister. That got his attention. Caroline, what does she have to do with? Everything, I said flatly. You think broadcasting curiosity about the Castellano family is consequence-free? You think asking strangers in public places about organized crime connections is just innocent inquiry? You're painting a target on everyone connected to me. Including Mom. Marcus stepped forward. Your brother-in-law helped me save my business 10 years ago, he said. When larger competitors tried to destroy me through intimidation and vandalism, Antonio intervened. He made sure I could keep my shop open, keep my employees working, keep supporting their families. He gestured at the shop around us. Everything you see here exists because Antonio Castellano believed honest businesspeople deserved protection from bullies. That's what the Castellano family does. They help people who have nowhere else to turn. And your questions, Vincent added quietly, are making people wonder if we have a problem that needs handling. Do you understand what I'm saying, Dennis? Dennis's face had gone pale. He was finally grasping that this wasn't abstract gossip. This was real danger he'd stumbled into through arrogance and stupidity. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice small. I leaned forward. I'm going to make you an offer. Just once. Pay attention because I won't repeat it. He nodded mutely. Your business is failing, I said. Not because of bad luck or market forces, but because you make poor decisions and treat people badly. Money alone won't fix that. But I'm willing to provide a one-time cash infusion of $50,000 to stabilize your immediate problems. His eyes widened with desperate hope. I'll also introduce you to business consultants who actually know what they're doing. People who can help you restructure your operations properly, if you're willing to listen and follow their advice. Thank you, he started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. In exchange, you stop asking questions about Dad and the Castellano family. Completely. You treat my mother with basic decency. And you acknowledge publicly that you misjudged my father. His expression shifted, hope warring with pride. Publicly? What does that mean? It means calling the relatives who heard you mock Dad at his funeral and telling them the truth. That Antonio Castellano was a successful businessman who built a significant legacy, and you were wrong to disrespect him. The apology would cost him more than the money. I could see that calculation playing across his face. If you accept, I continued, we move forward with clear understanding that this is the only help you'll ever receive from me. If you refuse, you handle your bankruptcy alone and explain to Aunt Rebecca and your kids why you turned down help that could have saved them. Dennis sat in the worn chair across from me, his hands gripping the armrests. Pride fighting desperation. Ego battling survival instinct. How do I know you'll actually give me the money? He asked finally. That this isn't just some trick? Vincent pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the desk. Bank check. $50,000. Written out to Dennis Harper's business account. Sign the agreement, make the calls, and it's yours today. Dennis stared at the envelope like it might bite him. What happens if I say no? He asked. Then you leave, I said simply. And we never have this conversation again. And you figure out bankruptcy on your own while wondering what would have happened if you'd chosen differently. The silence stretched. I could see him working through scenarios, trying to find an angle, a way to get the money without paying the price I was demanding. The calls, he said finally. What exactly do I have to say? The truth. That you misjudged Antonio Castellano. That he was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises. That you were wrong to disrespect him at his funeral and you regret your words. Who do I call? Start with Aunt Melissa. Then whoever else heard you call Dad a crook with nothing. I pulled out my phone. We'll do it right now. On speaker. So there's no confusion about whether you kept your end of the agreement. He looked at Vincent, who remained expressionless. Looked at Marcus, who just shrugged. Looked at me and saw no mercy, no flexibility, just the deal on the table and the clock ticking. Fine, he said finally. I accept. I handed him my phone with Melissa's number already pulled up. Make the call. His hand shook slightly as he dialed. When Melissa answered, I put it on speaker. Dennis, she said surprised. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Melissa, He cleared his throat. I need to tell you something. About Antonio. About what I said at his funeral. I waited. So did everyone else in the room. I was wrong, Dennis said, the words coming out stiff but clear. Antonio Castellano was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises and contributed to his community. I misjudged him completely. I disrespected him at his funeral and I regret my words. The silence on the other end of the line was loaded. Then Melissa laughed, not unkindly but with genuine surprise. Well, I didn't expect that. What changed your mind, Dennis? I learned more about what he actually built, Dennis said, which wasn't exactly a lie. And I realized I'd been unfair to him and to Olivia. So I'm apologizing. Publicly. To anyone who'll listen. After he hung up, I had him call 2 more relatives who'd been at the funeral. Each time the apology came out smoother, more practiced, but still fundamentally honest. When the last call ended, Vincent slid the envelope across the desk. The consultants will contact you Monday morning, I said. Listen to them. Follow their advice. And Dennis? If I hear you've been asking questions about the family again, this arrangement ends. Permanently. He grabbed the envelope and left without another word, walking to his car like a man who'd just survived something dangerous without fully understanding how close he'd come to disaster. 2 days later, a letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letterhead was expensive, the language formal and threatening. On behalf of our client, Rebecca Harper, we are writing to formally challenge the validity of Antonio Castellano's will and the legitimacy of his estate. I read through the accusations, claims that Dad's wealth must have been acquired illegally, demands for detailed accounting of every asset, threats to involve federal authorities if I didn't comply within 30 days. I called Patricia Williams, Dad's estate attorney, and read her the letter over the phone. She laughed. Actually laughed. This is the most toothless legal threat I've seen in months, she said. Every asset Antonio left you came with documentation that would survive any scrutiny. We have decades of tax returns, business licenses, property records, all completely legitimate. So Rebecca doesn't have a case? She doesn't even have standing to bring one, Patricia said. She's not a beneficiary, not a spouse, not someone with any legal claim to the estate. Her lawyer is either incompetent or knows this is frivolous but took her money anyway. Relief washed over me. So we just ignore it? Not quite, Patricia said, her tone shifting. Rebecca's accusation of illegality could invite attention from authorities who'd love an excuse to investigate the Castellano family. We need to respond with overwhelming documentation that proves legitimacy while making clear that false accusations carry consequences. She paused. With your permission, I'll prepare a response that buries her lawyer in evidence. Tax returns, business licenses, audit reports, everything that proves Antonio's wealth was legitimate. And I'll include language that makes clear continued harassment would be inadvisable. Do it, I said. That evening my doorbell rang. Madison stood on my front step, mascara streaked down her face, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Can we talk? She asked. Please? Just the two of us. I almost said no. Almost closed the door and let her deal with whatever crisis had brought her here. But something in her expression, raw pain instead of her usual calculated performance, made me step aside. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd hosted the Christmas dinner that changed everything. She stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap, clearly struggling to find words. I've been jealous of you since we were kids, she said finally. Not of what you had. Of how you had it. I waited. Your dad loved you, she continued, her voice breaking. Really loved you. He knew who you were, what you cared about, what made you happy. My dad. She laughed bitterly. He sees me as a reflection of himself. If I succeed, it proves he's successful. If I fail, it embarrasses him. He doesn't actually know me at all. I'd never heard Madison talk like this. Honest, vulnerable, without her usual armor of superiority. At the funeral, when I mocked your tears, your grief. She looked up, meeting my eyes. Part of me was angry because I knew I'd never have that kind of loss. Because I've never had that kind of love. And that made me cruel in ways I'm ashamed of now. What changed? I asked. My parents told me I'm being disloyal by not supporting Mom's legal challenge against you, she said. That a good daughter would stand with family regardless of whether they're right or wrong. And I realized, they don't actually care about me. They care about my usefulness. My compliance. She wiped at her tears. I'm not asking for money. Or favors. I just wanted to apologize. Actually apologize for the first time in my life without any agenda behind it. I studied her face, looking for the calculation, the performance I'd learned to expect. But all I saw was exhaustion and honesty. If you're serious about starting over, I said slowly, building something real instead of just pretending, I know people who could help you find legitimate work. But it would mean earning your success instead of having it given to you. Madison nodded. I understand. And I know I don't deserve your help after how I treated you. But if you're willing to give me a chance, I'll prove I'm serious about changing. For the first time, I saw something genuine in her expression instead of the mask she usually wore. Maybe redemption was possible. Even for people who'd spent years being cruel. 6 weeks passed in a blur of business meetings, legal responses, and the gradual reshaping of relationships that had been broken for decades. Then Don Salvatore called with an invitation. I'm hosting an event, he said. To honor your father's contributions to the community. Scholarships he funded, businesses he helped establish, families he assisted during hard times. It should have happened years ago, but Antonio preferred working quietly. Now it's time people understood what he built. The event was held at Marina Bay's flagship restaurant on a Saturday afternoon in early February. Over 100 people filled the space. Business owners, scholarship recipients, community leaders, people whose lives Dad had touched in ways I was only beginning to understand. Uncle Dennis and his family received invitations. I didn't expect them to come. But when I arrived, there they were, sitting in the back looking uncomfortable but present. Even Aunt Rebecca had shown up, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. Don Salvatore opened the event with a speech about community, family, and the quiet ways that good people improve the world around them. He talked about Dad's business acumen, his dedication to helping others, his belief that success meant nothing if it didn't improve people's lives. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He invited Uncle Dennis to speak. My uncle stood slowly, walking to the microphone like a man approaching something he'd been dreading. His face was pale, his hands gripping note cards that shook slightly. "I'm Dennis Harper," he began, his voice uncertain. "Antonio Castellano's brother-in-law. And I owe everyone here an apology, but especially my niece Olivia." He glanced at me, then back at his notes. "For 23 years I misjudged Antonio completely. I let prejudice and misunderstanding blind me to who he really was and what he was building. I called him a crook. I treated his family with disrespect. And at his funeral..." His voice cracked slightly. "At his funeral I said things that were cruel and completely wrong." The room was silent except for Dennis's voice. Antonio Castellano was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises that employed hundreds of people and improved this community in ways I never bothered to see. He was generous, principled, and dedicated to helping people who had nowhere else to turn. And I was too arrogant to recognize any of that. He looked directly at me. "Olivia, I'm sorry. For the funeral. For every family gathering where I made you feel small. For every time I disrespected your father's memory. I was wrong about everything." It wasn't eloquent. His delivery was awkward and parts of it sounded rehearsed. But it was sincere. And public. And exactly what I'd asked for. Afterward, people approached me with stories about Dad I'd never heard. A woman whose medical bills he'd paid when her insurance lapsed. A man whose small restaurant Dad had helped save during the recession. A teenager who'd received a scholarship that made college possible when her family couldn't afford it. "Your father never wanted recognition," the teenager's mother told me, tears in her eyes. "He just wanted to help. That's the kind of person he was." I stood there listening to story after story, realizing Dad had touched far more lives than I'd ever known. This gathering was showing me the full scope of his legacy, not just the businesses and properties, but the human impact of 25 years of quiet generosity. As people started leaving, Mom appeared at my elbow. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Privately." We found a quiet corner in the restaurant, away from the remaining guests. Mom looked smaller somehow, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. "I'm moving," she said without preamble. "To Oregon. To live near Melissa." The news shouldn't have surprised me, but it still landed with unexpected weight. "When?" I asked. "End of the month. I've already started packing." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I can't stay here anymore, Olivia. Everywhere I look, I'm reminded of Antonio and what I failed to do. What I failed to be. Mom. I let my family treat him like garbage for 23 years, she interrupted. I stood silent at his funeral while they mocked him. I chose their approval over his dignity and your well-being. I don't know how to live with that." Her voice broke on the last words. "Can you forgive me?" she asked. "Someday. I'm not asking for now. I know I don't deserve it now. But maybe someday." I thought about all the years of silence, all the moments she could have stood up and chose not to. About the funeral where she'd let them destroy us without saying a word. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Forgiveness isn't something I can force. But I understand you did what you thought you had to do to survive. I wish you'd been stronger. I wish you'd chosen us. But I understand." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, worn at the edges like it had been handled many times over the years. "Your father wrote this for you 10 years ago," she said. "He made me promise not to give it to you until you were older and ready to understand. Think, I think you're ready now. After she left, I sat alone in that quiet corner and opened the letter with shaking hands. My dearest Olivia. Asterisk, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope your mother had the wisdom to give this to you when the time was right. There are things I need you to know, things I couldn't say while I was alive without revealing truths I wanted to protect you from. Asterisk. Asterisk, I built an empire, yes. Accumulated wealth, created businesses, established connections. But none of it matters compared to the only thing I got completely right, being your father. Asterisk. Asterisk, by the time you read this, you'll probably know about my real family, about the Castellano organization, about the world I kept separate from you. I made that choice deliberately. Not because I was ashamed of you or ashamed of that world, but because I wanted you to have choices I never had. Asterisk. Asterisk, real strength isn't about power or money, Olivia. It's about knowing who you are and what you stand for even when the world tries to tell you different. It's about making choices based on principles rather than fear. It's about using whatever resources you have to make life better for people who can't do it themselves. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you choose to walk away from everything I built, I'll be proud of you. If you choose to embrace it and continue the work, I'll be proud of you. The choice is what matters. The freedom to decide your own path. Asterisk. Asterisk, remember that dignity and patience are their own forms of strength. Remember that revenge is hollow but justice is necessary. Remember that the measure of a person isn't what they accumulate but what they give and who they protect. Asterisk. Asterisk, I love you more than all the money in all the banks in all the world. You are my greatest achievement, my proudest legacy, my best self made real. Asterisk. Whatever you choose, whatever you become, know that I'm proud of you. With all my love. That. I cried in that quiet corner of the restaurant, finally grieving properly without anger or revenge or plans clouding the loss. Just pure grief for the man who'd loved me unconditionally and built an empire to protect me while teaching me to be strong enough not to need it. The months that followed were full of learning and building. Vincent continued my education in both legitimate business operations and the more complex aspects of family obligations. I established the Antonio Castellano Foundation, expanding the scholarship programs and community assistance initiatives Dad had funded quietly for years. Madison actually followed through on her promise to change. She started at one of our restaurants as assistant manager, working under Isabella, who had no patience for performance or laziness. Madison worked harder than I'd expected. Early mornings, late nights, learning the business from the ground up. She's got potential, Isabella told me after 3 months. If she stays humble and keeps working, she might actually build something real. Our relationship wasn't warm. Probably never would be. But there was mutual respect developing, built on honest work rather than family obligation. Aunt Melissa became an unexpected mentor, calling weekly to check in and offer wisdom about navigating family complexity. The best revenge, she told me one evening, isn't destroying people who hurt you. It's building something so good that their absence from it becomes their punishment. I thought about that often. Rebecca and Dennis were largely out of my life now, dealing with their own problems while I built something meaningful with the resources Dad left me. A year after Dad's death, I sat in Don Salvatore's study reviewing quarterly reports and discussing family business. He listened to my ideas about moving more operations into legitimate territory, expanding community programs, making the Castellano name synonymous with community investment rather than just power and influence. You have your father's strategic mind, he observed, but your own moral compass. You question things Antonio accepted automatically. That's not weakness, Olivia. That's evolution. He poured us both whiskey, a ritual we developed over months of these meetings. The family has to change with each generation, he continued. Otherwise it becomes brittle and breaks. Your father understood that. He built the foundation that allows you to even consider the path you're proposing. Do you think it's possible? I asked. Actually moving everything legitimate? With patience and strategy? Yes. He smiled slightly. Your father spent 25 years building trust and infrastructure. You have the advantage of starting from his foundation. But it will take time. Years. Maybe decades. As I drove home through streets I now understood in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago, I thought about the girl who'd stood at her father's funeral in discount store shoes being mocked by people who didn't know who she was. That girl was gone. Not destroyed but transformed. I'd learned that revenge could be about revelation rather than destruction. That power was most effective when applied with precision rather than fury. That dignity and patience were their own forms of strength. I was Olivia Castellano, daughter of Antonio Castellano, heir to his empire and his values, building a legacy that honored his name while creating my own path forward. The discount store shoes that Madison had mocked were in my closet at home. I kept them as a reminder, not of humiliation but of how far I'd come and who I'd become. My father's greatest gift wasn't the $42 million he left me. It was teaching me through his example that true strength meant knowing who you are and what you stand for, even when the world tried to tell you different. And now I was using that gift to build something worthy of his memory. Something that would last. If this story of justice and legacy had you hooked from that first funeral insult to the final triumph, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when those black SUVs pulled up at the cemetery and Vincent Moretti bowed to Olivia while her family's faces went white. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Want more powerful revenge stories where the underestimated rise up and reclaim what's theirs? Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.